St. Louis, one of the true baseball cities. Some people say they have the best fans in baseball. Imagine if those fans were there right now and loving their St. Louis Browns, while the Cardinals make people happy in the state of Texas. That almost happened. This is Locked On MLB.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. This show is hopefully it's your first listen. We're available on all your free podcasting catchers. Follow us on Twitter at Locked On MLB Pods. Same handle for Instagram. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. You know, there's one thing I love about I love baseball history. I love the narrative of baseball, and I love thinking about those alternate universes, those ways that baseball history could have zigged instead of zagged. Baseball history could have evolved in a totally different direction if one tiny thing had happened or another. A few weeks ago, I talked about what would have happened had the Dodgers not left Brooklyn, had the Dodgers got the stadium that they were fighting so hard for to be basically where the Barclays Center is now for the Brooklyn Nets, what that would have meant for baseball in California, what that would have meant for the history of baseball in Minnesota and in Washington, for that matter. All those things were just on the delicate precipice. And if one thing had happened instead of another, we wouldn't have the Mets. Willie Mays would be beloved in Minneapolis. And chances are the Athletics and the Senators would find themselves in California. Well, the Athletics already did find themselves in California, so that's the one thing that remained true. Baseball would have been centered around Los Angeles Wrigley Field in California, and the fans of Brooklyn would resemble the fans of St. Louis. Probably the types of fans that we look at as being the best and most devoted in all of baseball. And we would have seen a new wrinkle in the Yankee-Dodger rivalry, because before the Yankees beat up on the Red Sox all the time, they beat up on the Dodgers primarily. And Dodger fans got their 2004 when they finally won in 1955. But they didn't really have time to enjoy that, because by 1957, they're out of there and they moved to Los Angeles, winning the World Series 2 years later, going on a great run. The Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale era, which began in Brooklyn, came to fruition in Los Angeles. What would have happened if Brooklyn Dodger fans were emboldened with a recent championship and maybe piled a few on top of the Yankees? I don't know, neither do you, but I love thinking about alternate universes like that, which brings us to St. Louis. Think about St. Louis as a great baseball city, a great baseball destination. As a big baseball fan, it's one of the few holes in my baseball fandom resume that I've actually never seen a game in St. Louis. I've never stepped foot in the city of St. Louis. If any of you are listening who are big Cardinal fans who want me to come see the St. Louis Cardinals play, please send me an email at info@sullybaseball.com or hit me up on Twitter at SullyBaseball. I would be more than happy to come to St. Louis as your guest and check out your Cardinals. I digress. When you think about the cities that are primarily baseball, Boston comes to mind. I would argue New York. Baseball is bigger than football in New York. I do think that if the Knicks ever won a championship, the basketball craze of New York City would have that go through the roof. But I think the Mets and the Yankees are bigger than the Giants and the Jets. That's not to say the Giants and the Jets are small potatoes, but I think the Yankees and the Mets fandom are the strongest in the city of New York. And I think St. Louis is one of the few cities where the baseball team is king. I mean, the NFL didn't even survive in St. Louis twice. Cardinals moved them. They borrowed the Rams for a little bit, and then they lost the Rams. But they remain some of the most devoted baseball fans on the planet Earth, the history, when you think about the history of the Cardinals, and the Cardinal history is plastered all over the stadium and all over their memories, going back to Rogers Hornsby, Grover Cleveland Alexander, and Frankie Frisch, and Dizzy Dean, and the Gas House Gang, and Stan Musial, to Lou Brock and Bob Gibson, to Red Shandies, right down to Ozzie Smith and the great teams of the '80s, and Albert Pujols and the great teams of the 2000s and early 2010s. There is a link, and it's one of the things that makes baseball uh, really unique to all against all American sports, is that there can be a through line to that narrative. And there is a comfort that while some of the teams have changed and moved cities, there is a comfort when you see a franchise like the Yankees, like the Red Sox, like the Tigers, like the former Indians, now the Guardians, like the White Sox, the Cubs, I mentioned the Pirates, the Reds, and the Phillies and the Cardinals, that there's a link that goes way, way back to some of them into the 19th century. And with the Cardinals, there's those pockets of greatness, the waves of greatness, as I just rattled off all those teams, and there's a connection. If you're a great Cardinal team and you're seeing the player, whether you look at some of the great stars on the Cardinals. If you look at Goldschmidt or an Arenado on the present day Cardinals, or you look at what Wainwright and Yadier Molina, who are links to the more recent championships, and are bringing on this other team, which is a steady playoff contender, who will probably win another pennant sometime this decade, and maybe even win a World Series at some point this decade. Just because the Cardinals are always going to be big time contenders, that means that the Molinas and all of them are linked to Hornsby and Musial and Gibson and Ozzie Smith and Brock and all of them. That's just how it works. And the fact that the Cardinals, with the exception of a few years, had a consistency in their look. They have the STL on their hat with the bat with the two little birds on it. So they're just sort of visually there's a connection to all of them. It's one of the constants of baseball. It's one of the things that helps create the illusion in baseball of timelessness, which baseball banks on. Baseball has the illusion that the past, present, and future are happening all in the same place. And like the players coming out of the cornfield in Field of Dreams, that if you are a champion in St. Louis, you are joining those ghosts of the past. You're aligning with them. You're joining their baseball Valhalla. And the consistency of the Cardinals over the years being one of the franchises to do that, probably more consistency of any franchise with the exception of the Yankees. Obviously, the Yankees are the one, since the arrival of Babe Ruth, were the one that did it the most. And so when the Jeters and the Paul O'Neills and the David Cohns of the world won the World Series in the mid '90s, and when A Rod and CC Sabathia were on the team that won in 2009, they joined the pantheon of Ruth, Garrick, DiMaggio, Lefty Gomez, Mantle, Dickey, Barrow, Whitey Ford, Reggie Jackson, all of them. It's they all find their connective tissue. And that's part of the appeal of baseball. That's part of what supposedly is the timelessness and the ghosts and the past, present, future happening. And the Cardinals do it wonderfully. They honor that history spectacularly. And that bedrock of consistency is one of the real um, cornerstones of baseball fandom. Yeah, you're gonna have to do changes. You're gonna have teams that change. I just casually mentioned the Dodgers. The Giants are another one. The A's, of course. But you have the change and the consistency both happening. And the idea that St. Louis, being anything but a Cardinal crazy city, seems borderline bananas. But guess what, folks? Borderline bananas almost happened. And it's not outrageous to think of it actually happening and how it could have happened, especially when you see some of the other franchises and some of the other movement in franchises at that time, and how baseball constantly seem to be wanting to tinker and change things, trying to fix what were perceived problems in the game. By the way, if you want to do any tinkering or fixing to your car, go to Rock Auto. With the ever increasing number of makes and models, it's impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questions and wait for the person behind the counter to order parts on their computer, choosing the only brands that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and money when using Rock Auto, which is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto's prices are reliably low for every customer. So they have everything you can need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go and explore their easy-to-use website today to find a solution for your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box so they know that we sent you? Amazing selection and reliably low prices are all the parts your car will ever need are at rockauto.com. And hey, let's talk a little bit about Built Bar. Built Bar, the best tasting protein bars out there, and it's helping me keep my New Year's resolution going deep into February as we round the quarter and head into March. Do you know what? It's easier to stick your resolutions and eat right when you have Built Bars that taste so great, it doesn't feel like you're eating something healthy. Have you tried the Puffs? If you haven't, you're missing out on one of the best Built Bar flavors yet. They're the first protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy. They're not just a protein bar, they are great. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. Puffs are a fan favorite with some incredible flavors like yummy, cinnamony, churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie. They're so good, and they're going to be your new favorite. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. Yes, Puffs included, 100% real chocolate. Are you kidding me? Low calorie, high protein. Replace your candy bars with these. They're better. Go to built.com, scroll down to the macros charts, and you're going to be blown away. High protein, low cal, high fiber, low carb. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. So many great flavors in Built Bar. You got mint brownie, coconut almond, and my personal favorite, raspberry. And new this month, white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If they think of a flavor, they'll make it. It'll be delicious, and it'll be good for you. At Built Bar, they're all about the taste. They make it taste delicious first, then figure out how to make it healthy. I don't know how they do it, but it works every time. Go to built.com and use promo code LOCK15, get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. You know, there was a period of time where cities had multiple teams that don't currently have multiple teams. And in the post-war years, it became clear that some of those cities couldn't support two teams. There just wasn't enough people. And also the population were going elsewhere. And baseball didn't seem quite ready to expand at that point. And we all know the story of what happened with the Giants and the Dodgers, that they both moved to California because the prospects were better out there. The Giants almost moved to Minneapolis. The Dodgers almost stayed in New York. And the Senators almost moved to Los Angeles. And they're probably going to take the A's to California because the A's were actually on the verge of making a deal to move to California when the owner of the A's died and sent everything into a little bit of chaos. Well, one of the cities that had two teams was the city of St. Louis. They had the Cardinals, they had the Browns. The Cardinals had the history, the Cardinals had the stars, the Cardinals had the World Series champions. The Browns were hapless. The Browns stunk. They had a couple players through the years who were pretty dang good, but most of the time they stunk. They only made it to the World Series once, and it happened during World War II when most of the big stars were fighting the war, and a bunch of 4F players and has-beens helped the Browns go to the World Series. Finally, the city of St. Louis was going to have a St. Louis Browns World Series. Who did they wind up playing? The St. Louis Cardinals, who they lost to. So even at their greatest moment, the Browns were second banana to the Cardinals. But the city of St. Louis wasn't big enough for both teams. But there was someone who had a let's just call it an interesting idea of what to do with the Browns. It was Bill Veeck. Now, Bill Veeck, they keep calling him a colorful owner. Anytime you read the book, Veeck as in Wreck, his biography, it's spectacular. He owned the Cleveland Indians, integrated the Indians by bringing in Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. The last time the Indians won the World Series was in 1948 under Bill Veeck's leadership. He purchased the Browns in 1951, sold the Indians, he bought the Browns, and he was the team vice president and kept doing all this crazy promotions, including sending the 3'7" little person Eddie Goodell to bat so he can be the shortest person in the history of Major League Baseball. He did all sorts of crazy things to make for fan involvement with the game. Okay. He also started. He brought Satchel Paige to the Browns. He also started signing former Cardinals. Dizzy Dean was no longer playing, but he was signed to do broadcasts for the St. Louis Browns, not the Cardinals. One of the great Cardinals of all time was calling Browns games. Rogers Hornsby, the first great superstar of the St. Louis Cardinals, the one who finally led the Cardinals to a World Series title, was signed by the Browns to be a manager. Harry Brechin, Vern Stevens, all these Cardinal favorites were being gobbled up. They were far past their prime, but they were now wearing Browns uniforms. And basically, Veeck was trying to steal Cardinal fans and have them come to the Browns. Well, that was a futile effort, correct? The Cardinals were always so great. Not so fast. The Cardinals were great in the mid 1940s as they, from the Hornsby to the Gas House Gang to Musial, they were consistently in the World Series between 1926 and 1946. But after 46, right around the time baseball started integrating and the Giants and the Dodgers suddenly became the powerhouses of the National League, the Cardinals faded back and they went from being they were a winning team, but they were not one of the elite teams anymore. And ownership started to crumble. The owner of the Cardinals, Breeden, was he he had some tax issues. He also had cancer, and they sold the team uh, to a local real estate investor named Fred Saig, and he was kind of a shady person who had all sorts of tax issues and tax dodging and everything. And Saig took hold of the team right around the time Bill Veeck was buying the Browns, and all sorts of craziness was happening when he was running the team, kind of running it into the ground, doing all sorts of tax dodges, doing all sorts of had to plead no contest to tax evasion, and forced the commissioner of baseball to put the team up for sale. Now, Cardinal ownership was in turmoil. Browns ownership was steady. The Browns owners were trying to lure the fans with all the fan favorite stuff, while the Cardinals didn't even know who was going to own the damn team. And so, right around that time, a bunch of people came in to try to save the St. Louis Cardinals. No local offers came in, and a group of businessmen looked to break ground and bring baseball to Texas, Houston, Texas. And the Cardinals had the top minor league team was in Houston. And kind of like how the Giants took a look and said, hey, our top minor league team is in Minneapolis, so therefore maybe we should move to Minneapolis. The idea of moving in to Houston would not require St. Louis to buy any territorial rights away from anything else. And so the idea of the Cardinals leaving St. Louis was not only possible, it was probable, with nobody else to come in, then the idea of the Cardinals uprooting and heading to Houston, which would have been a fresh new market and a chance to just start anew, made sense. And Cardinal fans feeling hurt would look up and say, well, at least we got the Browns with a share of familiar faces on the team. And think about, if you think that that's outlandish, that the team with with the greater history would have left and the team that was kind of the proverbial second banana would have stayed. Think about what just had happened in Philadelphia. The A's, like the Cardinals, had years and years of, the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. The A's were regular participants in the World Series, while the Phillies consistently were garbage. But it was turmoil in the ownership, in this case, the Mac House, that put the A's in a position where they had to look elsewhere. And that's when they moved to Kansas City, leaving Philadelphia for the Phillies. The A's should have been a team like the Cardinals, like the Tigers, like the Red Sox, that stayed in Philadelphia and had those deep roots going to the past. Well, the Phillies should have gone to a place like Kansas City or maybe even Los Angeles. But the Phillies were the team in Philadelphia, and the Browns were very much this close to being the team of St. Louis. Then Anheuser-Busch stepped in. Augie Busch and Budweiser stepped in and bought the team, Busch Stadium, all the ties to Budweiser. And the second that Bill Veeck saw that Budweiser was buying the team, Anheuser-Busch, Augie Busch was buying the club, he knew, I'm not going to be able to compete with that, and looked for a place to move the Browns. At first, it looked like Milwaukee was going to be an ideal place. And in fact, the Browns had originally played in Milwaukee way, 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 way back then. But when that didn't work out because of territorial rights, suddenly the city of Baltimore opened up and the Browns became the Orioles. And the Cardinals were able to put their deep roots into St. Louis. And while they didn't win a pennant in the 1950s, they wound up becoming one of the great powerhouses of the 1960s. And imagine if a powerhouse Cardinal team led by Brock and Bob Gibson and all of them played in Houston instead of St. Louis. What would baseball history have been like then? It's one of those things to think about, and the repercussions of what could have happened is, quite frankly, one of the things that makes me fascinated by the concept of these parallel universes. And it's a surefire bet that today's Cardinal fans, will be rabid, diehard Browns fans to this day. And if you're going to make any bets, go to BetOnline. Football might be over the season, but basketball's in full swing with both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, and player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your source for hockey, boxing, UFC, right down to Olympic coverage and information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn about trends and action. BetOnline is where the game starts. Okay, now stop and think about a couple of things. The beloved Cardinals would be in Houston. Stan Musial would be finishing his career in Houston, unless he was going to be one of those people like how Willie Mays finished his career with the Mets, or Hank Aaron finished his career with the Milwaukee Brewers, or Duke Snider came back to the Mets. Would Stan Musial finish his career as a member of the Browns so he could end his career in St. Louis? That may have been something that happened. But Houston would have had a team. It would have been the initial team to sort of put the stake in the ground that Houston is a major league city. And their popularity probably would have gone through the roof and probably would have sparked a dome stadium earlier than we actually had one. We probably would have had some form of a dome stadium sometime in the 1950s. You would have had that. You would have seen the Browns flourish in St. Louis. Now, does that mean they would have had the same exact history that they would have had in Baltimore? Probably not. Probably not. You're probably not gonna have the Frank Robinsons and the Brooks Robinsons and the Boog Powells and everything like that. But with no Browns moving to Baltimore, does that mean we don't have the great history of the Baltimore Orioles, especially their dominance in the mid 60s through the 70s? Is that all changed? Do we not have Cal Ripken? Or is Cal Ripken beloved in some other city, some other team? Without the competition of Baltimore sapping away fans, do the Senators just stay in Washington? And we don't have the move to Minnesota or to Texas, and we don't have the need to move a team from Montreal there. Now, the idea of a Cardinal team being so beloved that they couldn't move, just remember the Dodgers moved when they were at the peak of their popularity, at least maybe not the box office, but certainly in the hearts and minds of their fans. It was the boys of summer. It was Roy Campanella, Jackie Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snyder. They ripped that team away, which would have seemed outrageous just a couple of years prior to when it happened. So a Cardinal team leaving for Houston would have been relatively reasonable at that point. But one of the other things that a couple of these alternate universes kind of bring to mind, however, is let's say this event happened where the Cardinals move to Houston and the Dodgers get their stadium in Brooklyn. One of the biggest challenges that ever came to baseball was the threat of the Continental League, which was a third major league that was going to be formed in the early 1960s, and it was going to have Branch Rickey as their commissioner. Branch Rickey was usually at the helm of stuff that was big time changing in baseball. He basically invented the farm system and integrated the game. His third act was going to be create the Continental League. And the Continental League was going to put teams in major markets that didn't have teams. And when it didn't come to fruition, it forced baseball to expand. Well, two of the big reasons why baseball felt that pressure to expand, and that initial expansion was in 1961 and 1962, was to put a team in Washington, to find a second team for New York, and to finally put a team in Houston. Well, if no team entered Baltimore, there would not be a reason for a team in Washington. If the Dodgers had stayed, there wouldn't be a need to expand there. And if the Cardinals had moved to Houston, then the two biggest chips that the Continental League had on their side, which was teams in Houston and New York, forcing the expansion to create the Astros, they were called the Colt 45s initially, and the Mets, would not have been necessary. So we may not even have had expansion at the rate that it happened in the 1960s. There probably would eventually have been expansion, but it may not have come at that point. Baseball was dragged kicking and screaming mainly because of the threat that the Continental League faced. So the Cardinals would have been the most beloved team of Houston. St. Louis fans would love their Browns. And all those great players that I rattled off, Musial, Dizzy Dean, Rogers Hornsby, Frankie Frisch, all those great players would kind of fade away in the collective memory of St. Louis fans the way that Jimmy Fox, and Lefty Grove, and Rube Waddell, and all the great players from the Philadelphia A's of the 1910s, 1900s, 1910s, 20s, and 30s have faded out in Philadelphia lore. They're no longer rattled off as beloved members of Philadelphia sports history that are known from their fans because the fans are Phillies fans. Similarly, in New York, sure, you have Willie Mays and Jackie Robinson, the players who were embraced by the baby boomer world. But the likes of Christy Mathewson and Mel Ott and Bill Terry and Carl Hubble and all the great Giants players in the past have faded away in ways that Ruth, Gehrig, and DiMaggio have not. And so A lot of baseball would have been very, very different if Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, Augie Busch didn't step in and rescue the St. Louis Cardinals from a tax evasion mess and find themselves deep in the heart of Texas. I love talking about alternate realities because it shows us how fragile what we consider reality to be. And that if that had happened, that other version that I would have said, where Cardinal fans are in Houston, St. Louis fans are Browns fans, and back then the Cardinals played there, but we don't really remember that much. That would be the reality we all know. And thinking about Cardinal fans in St. Louis all these years later, that would just be strange, wouldn't it? So follow us at Locked On MLB on Twitter and on Instagram. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. Make your second listen be Locked On Bets, where they have all your gambling needs with host, your boy Q, and expert analysis from Lee Sterling. Send me any thoughts you may have about topics, questions, alternate universes, complaints, whatever you want. Send it to me personally at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram, or if you're following us here on YouTube, put it in the comments section here. Thinking about what could have been in St. Louis and how they would have loved their Browns. This is Locked On MLB. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.